He told me never to open the box until he was gone. I didn't listen. Inside was a letter dated 3 years before he ever left for war. Written to me. Never sent. Folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. I read it standing in his childhood bedroom, while he was 2 floors below, laughing with his brother like nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed the moment I read his handwriting. Because the boy I grew up loving as a friend's older brother had loved me first, long before I ever let myself imagine it was possible. He came home from the military with medals he wouldn't talk about, in a silence that scared me more than any story could have. I thought I was falling for a stranger. I didn't know I was falling for a promise he made when I was still too young to understand it. But what happened next changed my life forever. The town of Thistlewick Bay smelled like salt and wet pine even in the middle of summer, and on the afternoon Dane Aldridge came home, the whole harbor seemed to hold its breath. Theo Marsh stood at the end of the ferry dock with his hands shoved into the pockets of a jacket too warm for the weather, watching the boat cut through gray water like it was reluctant to arrive. He hadn't planned on coming. He had told himself, 3 separate times that morning, that it wasn't his business to be there, that this homecoming belonged to Micah and their mother and no one else. But his feet had carried him down the hill anyway, past the bakery with its fogged windows, past the boarded-up cannery, until he was standing exactly where he swore he wouldn't be standing, waiting for a man he hadn't seen in 4 years. Micah Aldridge was already there, bouncing on the balls of his feet like he was 12 again instead of 23, grinning so hard it looked like it hurt. He turned when he heard Theo's footsteps on the dock boards. "You came," he said, surprised and pleased in equal measure. "I thought you had the shop today. I closed early." Theo shrugged like it meant nothing. It meant everything. He'd shut the flower shop at noon and told himself it was for Micah, his best friend since they were 7 years old, building forts out of driftwood on this exact beach. He hadn't let himself think too hard about the other name attached to this day. The ferry groaned against the dock, and then there he was. Dane Aldridge stepped off the boat with a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and Theo's breath caught somewhere behind his ribs in a way that frightened him immediately. The boy who used to tease him for crying during sad movies, who used to drive him and Micah to the drive-in 3 towns over because neither of them had a license yet, had become something else entirely. He was leaner than Theo remembered, his jaw sharper, a thin white scar tracing the edge of his left eyebrow that hadn't been there before. But it was his eyes that stopped Theo cold, the same warm brown he remembered, except now they moved like a man cataloging exits in a room he used to feel safe in. "There he is," Dane said, voice rougher than it used to be, and pulled his brother into a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind of hug that says more than either brother would ever put into words. Over Micah's shoulder, Dane's eyes found Theo, and something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or something quieter and harder to name, before he blinked it away. "Theo Marsh," he said, "still following my brother around like a stray cat. Someone has to keep him out of trouble," Theo said, and was relieved his voice came out steady. Dane's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Good luck with that." They walked up from the harbor together, the 3 of them, gulls wheeling overhead, and the late afternoon light turning the water the color of a bruise healing. Theo told himself the tightness in his chest was nothing. He told himself a lot of things that day that weren't true. The Aldridge house sat on Cutter's Rise, an old 2-story with a wraparound porch that their father had built before he passed, back when Dane was only 16 and had to become the man of the house overnight. Theo remembered that year clearly, remembered Dane working 2 jobs after school, remembered him showing up to Micah's birthday party exhausted, but smiling anyway, remembered the particular ache of watching someone carry more than they should have to. Dinner that first night was loud with relief. Their mother, Colette, cried twice and pretended both times it was the onions. Micah told stories that made Dane laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind Theo hadn't heard in years and hadn't realized he'd missed until it hit him square in the chest. But there were moments, too, when Dane went quiet without warning, his fork stilling halfway to his mouth, his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. Once, a car backfired out on the road, and Dane's whole body went rigid for exactly 2 seconds before he forced his shoulders back down, laughed it off, made a joke about needing more coffee. Theo watched it happen and felt something in himself crack quietly open. Not pity, nothing so simple as pity, but a fierce and sudden need to understand what 4 years overseas had cost this man, and what it would take to give any of it back. "You're staring," Micah whispered later, when they were doing dishes together while Dane and Colette sat on the porch. "I am not. Theo. He's different," Theo said, quieter than he meant to. "That's all." Micah dried a plate slowly, thoughtfully, in a way that made Theo brace for whatever was coming. "He asked about you, in his letters. Not a lot. Just, he'd ask how you were doing. If the shop was doing okay. Stuff like that." Theo's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Why would he ask about me?" Micah just looked at him, an unreadable look, and didn't answer. Over the following weeks, Thistlewick Bay folded Dane back into itself the way small towns do, slowly, with casseroles and handshakes and old men at the hardware store clapping him on the back. But Theo noticed the things no one else seemed to. He noticed that Dane sat with his back to the wall in every restaurant they visited. He noticed that Dane flinched, almost imperceptibly, at sudden loud sounds, and then spent the next several minutes performing normalcy like it was a costume he had to keep adjusting. He noticed that Dane rarely slept past 4 in the morning, because more than once Theo passed the Alderidge house on his early walk to open the flower shop and saw the kitchen light already burning gold against the dark. One morning in early September, mist rolling thick off the water, Theo found Dane sitting alone on the porch steps, a mug of coffee cooling untouched in his hands, staring at nothing. "Couldn't sleep?" Theo asked, stopping at the bottom of the steps. Dane looked up, and for a moment something unguarded crossed his face before the wall came back up. Something like that. He studied Theo for a long moment. "You're up early too. Opening the shop. Tuesdays are delivery days." Theo hesitated, then sat down on the step below him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, an intimacy he hadn't quite meant to offer. "You can talk to me, if you ever wanted to. About whatever it is that keeps you up." Something shifted behind Dane's eyes, quick and complicated. "You don't want to know what keeps me up, Theo. Try me." Dane looked out at the mist for a long time before he spoke again, his voice low. "There was a kid in my unit. Callum, 19 years old, from some farm town in Ohio, talked about his dog more than he talked about anything else." He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "I was supposed to be watching his back that day. I was the one who told him it was clear." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Theo didn't say anything trite. He didn't say it wasn't his fault, or that he was sure Dane had done everything right, because he understood, somehow, that those words would only feel like sand thrown at a wound. Instead, he sat there in the cold morning air and let the silence hold both of them. And after a while, he felt Dane's shoulder finally lean, just slightly, into his. "Thank you," Dane said eventually, "for not trying to fix it." "I don't know how to fix it," Theo admitted. "I just didn't want you to be alone with it this morning." Dane looked at him then, really looked, in a way that made Theo's pulse stumble. "You never used to be this perceptive. When you were a scrawny 15-year-old following Micah around, I mean. People change," Theo said. "Apparently, so do former military men who used to make fun of my haircut." That earned a real laugh, short but genuine, and it felt like a small victory Theo wanted to keep collecting. Autumn deepened, and so did whatever was growing between them, something neither of them named, something built out of quiet mornings and unplanned conversations that ran 2 hours longer than either intended. Theo started leaving early to walk with Dane along the shore before the shop opened. Dane started finding reasons to stop by the flower shop in the afternoons, ostensibly to help carry deliveries, though Theo suspected the real reason had less to do with heavy boxes and more to do with the way Dane's shoulders visibly loosened whenever he stepped through the door. "You've got dirt on your face," Dane said one afternoon, watching Theo repot a stubborn hydrangea. "Occupational hazard." Dane reached out before he seemed to decide to, brushing a smudge from Theo's cheekbone with his thumb, and the shop went very quiet. Theo felt the touch everywhere, a warmth that had nothing to do with the greenhouse heat. Dane's hand lingered a half-second longer than necessary before he pulled it back, clearing his throat, looking almost as startled by himself as Theo felt. "Sorry," Dane said. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," Theo said, too quickly. "It's fine." Neither of them moved for a moment that stretched long and charged between them, full of things unsaid. Then the bell over the door jingled with a customer, and the moment dissolved, though it left something behind, a residue of possibility that followed Theo home that night, and kept him staring at his ceiling until well past midnight. It was 2 days later that Micah cornered him behind the shop counter, arms crossed, expression uncharacteristically serious. "I need to ask you something," Micah said, "and I need you to be honest." Theo's stomach dropped. "Okay, is something happening between you and my brother?" Theo opened his mouth to deny it, the reflex fast and automatic. But something in Micah's face stopped him. Not anger, he realized, but a strange, careful hope. "I don't know," Theo admitted finally. "Maybe. I don't know what it is yet." Micah exhaled, some tension leaving his shoulders that Theo hadn't clocked was there. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I need you to be careful with him, Theo. He's not okay. Not all the way. And if you two started something and it fell apart, I don't know what that would do to him. Or to you. I would never hurt him on purpose." "I know," Micah said. "That's not what worries me." He paused, choosing his next words with unusual care. "There's something you don't know. About before he left. I think it's his to tell you, not mine. But you should ask him. About the year before boot camp." Theo frowned. What happened the year before boot camp? Micah only shook his head, guilt and reluctance warring on his face. "Ask him," he said again, and wouldn't say another word about it. Theo didn't ask right away. He carried the question for nearly 2 weeks, turning it over at odd moments, while arranging tulips, while lying awake, while walking the shoreline beside Dane in a silence that had started to feel less like absence and more like closeness. It was on a gray October evening, the two of them sitting on the rocks past the lighthouse with a thermos of coffee between them, that Theo finally found the nerve. "Micah said I should ask you about the year before you left. Before boot camp." Theo watched Dane's profile carefully. "He said it was your story to tell." Dane went very still. For a long moment Theo thought he wouldn't answer at all, that he'd retreated somewhere Theo couldn't follow. Then Dane set down his coffee, laced his fingers together, and spoke without looking up. "I was 21. You were 17, still finishing high school, always coming around with Micah, always talking too fast about books nobody else our age had read." A faint, pained smile. "I used to make excuses to be home when you two came by. Told myself it was just because I liked having you both around. It took me longer than it should have to admit it was you, specifically, I was making excuses for." Theo's heart was pounding so loudly he was certain Dane could hear it over the waves. "Dane, I never said anything," Dane continued, forcing the words out now like he'd been holding them back for years, and the dam had finally cracked. "You were 17. I was your best friend's brother. It felt wrong and impossible, and I told myself I'd made it up in my head. So I left. I told everyone it was about serving my country, about needing structure after Dad died, and all of that was true too. But some of it was running from feeling something I didn't think I was allowed to feel." He finally looked at Theo, and his eyes were glassy in the fading light. "I wrote you a letter the week before I shipped out. I never sent it. I don't even know why I kept it. I think some part of me hoped that someday I'd have the courage to give it to you instead of burning it like I should have." Theo's throat had gone tight. "Where is it now?" "In a box. In my old room. I should have destroyed it years ago." Dane looked away, out at the black water. "I'm telling you because I don't want to keep lying to you by omission, Theo. Not after everything you've given me these past few months, just by sitting with me in the mornings, just by not looking at me like I'm broken. You deserve the truth, even if the truth makes things harder between us." Theo reached over, slowly, and took Dane's hand in his, lacing their fingers together with a certainty that surprised him. "It doesn't make things harder," he said. "It makes sense of something I've felt since the day you got off that ferry, and I couldn't figure out why my chest hurt so much." Dane looked down at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. "Theo, I'm not 17 anymore," Theo said softly. "And you're not running anymore. Are you?" For the first time since he'd come home, Dane looked at Theo without a single wall standing between them. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." What followed was not a fairy tale, because neither of them was foolish enough to expect one. It was slower than that, and harder one. There were nights Dane woke from nightmares that left him shaking and silent, and Theo learned not to reach for him too fast, learned instead to sit nearby and simply exist until Dane's breathing evened out. There were days Theo panicked over the shop's failing finances, a debt his late father had left behind that Theo had never told anyone about, ashamed of the inheritance of struggle, and it was Dane who sat with the ledgers at midnight, quietly working through numbers with the same discipline he'd brought to every task overseas, refusing to let Theo carry it alone. They found the letter together on a rainy November afternoon, in the box in Dane's old room exactly where he'd said it would be. Theo asked to read it, and Dane, hands trembling slightly, let him. Theo, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to give you this, but I need to write it down somewhere, or it will eat me alive. I think I've loved you since the summer you turned 16, and you spent 3 hours helping me plant tomatoes in Mom's garden, because I looked tired, and you said everyone deserves someone who notices. I notice you, Theo. I have for a long time. I'm leaving because I'm a coward, not because of anything you did. Maybe someday, if I come back different, if I come back brave enough, maybe someday I'll tell you the truth instead of hiding it in a box. Theo folded the letter carefully, tears he didn't try to hide slipping down his face. You came back, he said. You came back different, and you told me the truth. You did the brave thing, Dane. Just later than you planned. Dane pulled him close, resting his forehead against Theo's, both of them breathing in the quiet weight of years finally set down. Better late, he murmured, than never. The twist none of them saw coming arrived in the form of a phone call in early December, an offer from Dane's former commanding officer, a specialized training position stationed overseas, prestigious and well-paid, the kind of opportunity most veterans would call a second chance at purpose. Dane didn't tell Theo about it for 4 agonizing days, wrestling with it alone the way he'd wrestled with everything alone for years, until Theo found the offer letter by accident while helping him sort through mail on the kitchen table. You weren't going to tell me, Theo said, quiet and hurt, holding the letter like it might burn him. I didn't know how, Dane admitted, because saying it out loud would mean deciding, and I don't know if I can choose between the life I built healing here, with you, and the only other life I ever knew how to survive in. It would have been easy for Theo to beg him to stay, to make it about his own fear of losing what they'd only just found. Instead, sitting across the table from the man he loved, Theo forced himself to ask the harder question. What do you want, Dane? Not what you think you owe anyone. Not guilt over Callum, not obligation to a version of yourself that doesn't exist anymore. What do you actually want? Dane was quiet for a long time, turning the letter over in his hands. I used to think purpose only looked one way, he said finally, like it had to be earned through what I could sacrifice, what I could carry for other people until it broke me. But these past months, sitting with you in the mornings, rebuilding this shop together, learning how to just be still, that's felt like purpose too. Maybe more like it, actually. I think some part of me has been afraid that if I stop proving I deserve to survive, I'll lose the right to feel okay again. You don't have to earn the right to be happy, Theo said, reaching for his hand. Not with me. Not with anyone. What happened to Callum was never a debt you owe by suffering forever. Dane's eyes were wet when he looked up. I've spent so long thinking healing meant leaving again. What if it just means staying and letting someone actually see me? Then stay, Theo said simply. Not for me. For you. I'll be here either way, but I think you already know what you want. Dane turned down the offer 2 days later and told his old commanding officer, with a steadiness that surprised even himself, that he had found something in Thistlewick Bay worth building rather than running from. He began seeing a counselor in the next town over, twice a week, a quiet, unglamorous kind of courage that mattered more than any medal he'd carried home. Slowly, the mornings grew easier. The nightmares grew fewer. Micah watched his brother laugh again, watched Theo's eyes soften every time Dane walked into the shop, and never once said a word about the year Dane spent gathering the nerve to write a letter he never sent, because some stories only need telling once, to the person who was always meant to hear them. By spring, Dane had taken over the shop's back room and turned it into a small woodworking studio, building planters and trellises that Theo sold alongside his flowers. The two of them building something neither had dared imagine 4 years before on that same gray dock. On a warm evening in April, with the whole bay glowing gold under a setting sun, Dane found Theo among the rows of blooming hydrangeas and took his hand without a word, pulling a small worn envelope from his pocket. Not the old letter this time, but a new one. I wrote you something else, he said, voice unsteady with a different kind of fear now, the good kind. I figured it was time I stopped being afraid to say things out loud too. Theo opened it with trembling fingers and found only a single line inside. Will you let me spend the rest of my life noticing you, the way you once noticed me? Theo looked up at him, tears blurring the fading gold light, and answered the only way that felt true. I already did, he said. The day you got off that ferry, and I couldn't stop watching the way home looked on you. Dane pulled him close, and there, among the flowers Theo had spent years growing alone, two men who had once been strangers wrapped in silence finally let themselves be fully seen. Not soldiers, not broken things to be fixed, just two people who had found, in each other, a place soft enough to finally call home.